everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. Really good episode today. This is Kevin Huizenga. If you don't know who Kevin is, why don't I read you his bio right now? Originally from South Holland, a small town of Dutch immigrants in the suburbs of Chicago, comics creator Kevin Huizenga attended Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where he started drawing the influential mini-comic Super Monster. After moving to St. Louis, Kevin started the comic book series Or Else, the strip Leon Beyond with Dan Zetwalk, as well as his acclaimed series Ganges. Much of Kevin's work has been published by Drawn and Quarterly. He's won 5 Ignatz Awards and been nominated for Harvey and Eisner Awards, and he's constantly creating mini-comics, which you can get on his website. One of my most recent favorites is his Rumbling series, but you'll never go wrong with anything he makes. I talk about in this episode that I've been reading Kevin's comics for a couple decades now. I used to live in Pittsburgh. I went to University of Pittsburgh for undergrad, and then I lived there for a couple years afterwards while I tried to figure out what I want to do in life. And there's a wonderful comic book shop that opened up in that time called Copacetic Comics. It's still there. If you live in Pittsburgh, you're going through Pittsburgh, you gotta go to Copacetic Comics. This is not a paid ad. I just think it's great. But the owner of the shop, his name is Bill, and he's awesome at recommending comics. He's really good. He knows a lot of cool comics and things you might not have heard of. And at the time, he recommended Kevin's work to me, and I just fell in love, and it's really wonderful. So I hope you, if you haven't already, read Kevin's work, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you do, you want to check out other episodes of Beginnings, what I like to do here in the beginning is a little recommended if you like. If you like my talk with Kevin, maybe you like my talk with other people in comics. Why, I've talked to Chip Zdarsky, Cy Spurrier, Michael Kupperman, Chris Claremont, Paul Hornschmeyer, Kate Beaton, Gabrielle Bell, Lisa Hanawalt, Bill Griffith, Jim Starlin. Yes, tons of people from both mainstream and alternative comics. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear and you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. And a lot of awesome episodes coming up. Some comics people, Kelly Thompson is coming up, and Ryan North, who crosses both mainstream and alternative comics. A lot of great musicians coming up, including Frog Eyes. But enough of this. I'm going to go feed Squee, who wants his food back. And you're going to listen to this episode with Kevin. For a long time, with musicians that were like singer-songwriters, I tended to think that when they were writing songs, it was always from their own experience and their own point of view. And I tended to confuse the fact that this is when I was younger, that they would write characters in their songs.
Right. Yeah.
And I was thinking of this earlier. I was like, when I was thinking of talking to you, I was like, well, you're not Glenn Ganges. Am I saying Ganges?
No.
Is it Ganges?
Yeah. Well, I say Ganges because I'm from the Midwest, but it's like people overseas say Ganges, whatever. It's fine.
But like, I was like, oh, that's not you. I mean, maybe parts of it are you, or I don't know,
no,
but like,
it's not me. No, it's not.
Yeah.
And there was a point at which I'm dense enough that I didn't really realize that people thought it was me until a ways into it. I realized that people thought it was me. And then I was like, that's annoying. And I sort of fought against it. But then at a certain point, I like to play with it. So I would like, it became an interesting thing to think about. Like, maybe I should make, some of Glenn me and some of Glenn like really, really not me. I don't know. It just opened up story ideas that were fun for me to think about. And then even with that, like I play, I'm working on stories right now about a cartoonist, and they're kind of based on me, but they're really not based on me. It's like the character has a mustache and he smokes cigarettes all the time. I I don't have a mustache. I don't smoke cigarettes, whatever. But it's kind of like at the same, I don't know. You write a character and you mix it. But I think with, alternative comics tend to be dominated by a lot of autobio style cartooning. And so it's more of an assumption, I think, than otherwise. I guess, comedians do the same thing, where comedians, like, all the way back to the, I don't know, Dick Van Dyke or something, but like, they sort of play themselves, and they have the TV show and it's sort of based on them, but they're clearly like playing a character of themselves. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting with comedians. I mean, I'm married to a stand-up, and I know a lot of stand-ups personally, and I've gotten to meet a bunch. It's interesting whatever the interplay is between the character they play and who they really are. And there's a wide swath between, like, my wife is someone who is just on stage. She is herself with more energy. Right. And the things she tells, like, maybe like she'll change a fact just to make a punchline a little better, or like shorten a story so that it's a little better or more interesting or funnier, or punchier or whatever. Right. But it's essentially, she's like telling the truth on stage, versus I've seen some people who are fucking psychopaths, and then they go on stage and they're like the nicest person in the world. And that is so interesting to me, the kind of the wide gulf there is in those people between themselves and this fictional version of themselves, which is, and the only vantage point most people have into this person is through that fictional shell, which is like happy-go-lucky or whatever. And then inside it's like, Jerry Lewis or something like that. Just this like vicious monster.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, I was just sort of came up thinking like, oh, people are themselves, and, but then, after you see a few people like turn it on and turn it off, you're like, oh, and then like a whole new understanding of the world opens up, and like this, your innocence is gone, and you're like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah. But that's interesting though, this like interplay between you and like the characters you create too, because also like I'm a writer, and so obviously there's a lot of characters I write that have like parts of me, but I don't think I've ever written, I mean, except for the pilot I wrote in which the character was exactly me because it was about my life. But like,
yeah,
it's always like just like pieces of me, and then isn't that a Jewel album? Anyway, it's always just like parts of me, and then it goes off on its own.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like when I write, I'm not gifted in the way that some writers are, where they have all these characters just like populating all these voices in their head all the time. All these, they're able to create, like when I started out drawing comics, I wanted to draw comics, but I didn't have a sense of like, oh, I can write this whole, complex menagerie of characters. So I really was just based on myself, like just because of, it's just like, I don't know if I should say that it's like, a flaw in a writer, but it's, it makes me feel a little bit weak as a writer, like weak in my imagination, but like really like all I know is what I know. And so, but I still didn't want to do autobio. Autobio to me felt like a real crazy Hall of Mirrors situation where it's me, but I'm drawing myself, and I'm drawing myself like looking out at the reader. But when you're reading it, you're supposed to sort of see it through my eyes, but you're like seeing it through my eyes, but I'm also standing there and like I'm hiding things, but I'm also like, and also there's this tradition in autobio comics, alternative comics, where it's like there's this real tradition of like self-exposure. I mean, the stereotypical autobio like thing is that all these cartoonists would draw themselves masturbating. And it was like,
Uh-huh.
and it's sort of a rite of passage for an autobio cartoonist. I feel like almost that you have to draw that kind of stuff. And, for various reasons, it's like, I didn't really want to go down that path, and So, and I felt like it sort of had been done, et cetera, et cetera. And, I'm also a coward, et cetera, et cetera. But, so what am I trying to say here? So I wasn't really interested in being like, here's me, this is Kevin, like you're reading about Kevin and like, I'm going to tell you about my life, and I'm going to like share, I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in sort of like, let's walk around in the world, through comics, and let's look at things, and let's, and if I had an idea for like a scenario with some characters and it was funny, and then I would like also write that into it. But yeah, I didn't want it to be me, all me,
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, as I got older, I realized, of course, it's all about me. And so I did play around a little bit with the Hall of Mirrors type effect, and you kind of can't avoid it.
I mean, conceptually, as you thought about it, because it seemed like that was giving you pause, giving you what I'm going to say for me is a cloudy head. When I think of like conceptually like weird stuff that like it makes my head hurt, or like logistically weird, if that makes sense, where you're saying like, oh, it was me, but I'm watching me, and then someone's thinking that's me, but I'm there in third person.
Yeah.
Is that what happened in your head? Because that's what happens in my head when I try to think about that stuff.
Well, like on a real basic level in comics, like if you're going to draw an autobiographical comic, you got to draw yourself. So the first thing you have to figure out how to do is make a cartoon version of yourself. And it's like, right off the bat, that felt weird to me. It was like, do I draw myself as like cute? Do I draw myself as like super ugly? Do I draw, you know what I mean? Like you can tell a lot about a cartoonist by the way they draw themselves, and it's one of the fun things about comics is when you do read everybody's comics, but then when you finally meet them in person, and then you can kind of like triangulate what they're, what's going on in their mind, because they see themselves like this, but you see them like this, and etc.
Or is it false modesty? Are they like drawing themselves in some way, like maybe like making themselves less attractive, but it's actually false modesty to like project some kind of a certain kind of thing that they want the audience to see?
Who's to say what's false and what's true? And when it comes to modesty, you know what I mean? It's like, I think you want to go with modesty. You want to draw yourself as being like, it is the cartoonists who draw themselves as like, super charming and cute. And I think that's part of what happens with autobiocomics is that like comics, cartoon characters are automatically sort of like they have life to them, and they seem cool, and they seem like you want to love them. They're like these cute little drawings that are moving around on the page. And so I think most honest, thoughtful, self-reflective autobio cartoonists will undercut that by like showing themselves on the toilet or showing themselves barfing on themselves, or they have to like win their way into your heart through the side door by showing you how, it's the same thing probably with any kind of writer or comedian, etc.
You said earlier, it was a joke, but I want to know if there was any truth behind it. You were like, well, I'm a coward. And I didn't know. It was a joke, obviously, but like, is there any truth? Because I say that about myself sometimes too, and there is some truth when I say it.
Yeah, are you asking me if I'm a coward or not?
Not in an aggressive way, but
yeah, I meant like, no, I don't know.
Yeah, I just meant that like sometimes when I talk about like my past, I'm like, yeah, I was like, let's not say coward, but like afraid. I definitely like spent a lot of my life, and I'm still like stuck in fear as like a mode of being.
Sure. I mean, that's like one of the main things about life, I think, is figuring out what you're afraid of and figuring out how to deal with it,
Yeah. But is that like a main like driver for you? Fear?
Is it a main driver? I hope not. And when, seriously, like when when I really face it and when I really like realize it is that, then I sort of have a moment when I have to like think like, what am I doing here? Like, am I doing this out of fear? And what does that mean?
Because I will tell you this, through your writing, you seem like a very rational, you seem a logical kind of person, philosophical. I think that's a fair adjective. I don't know if you'll take it or not, but
sure. I think we're both philosophy majors. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I used to be a philosophy professor before I went to comedy.
Professor, yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. So you majored in it? What kind of philosophy?
I majored in it. I still read it. I still think about it. I mean, in the sense that that's rational. I think it's rational. My attraction to philosophy, I think I always trace it back to kind of like, I always had a love of difficult books. Like when I was a kid, I really liked the idea that I would come across some kind of text and then I couldn't understand it, but then I would eventually understand it.
Right.
And I think over the years, I wanted to read more and more difficult philosophy and get a sense like, what is this person talking about actually? And of course, there's all kinds of jargon and there's all kinds of BS, language in philosophy, but there's stuff that's difficult to read that it really is, they're saying something real. And when you really work through it and you think through it, it's real stuff, so. And I think that also, I was raised Protestant Christian, and we read the Bible, and I went to church twice on Sunday every week, and you would have to sit there and listen to a preacher like expound upon the word, and I think that also went into my wanting to like read the big books and figure out what it all meant in the big book,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree that there is a lot of pleasure in the epiphany, like a lot of like the thing that is crunching around your brain and you're like, I don't get this until it all does come into focus. And there is a lot of pleasure to be had in that moment.
Yeah. The lights all go on and you see how it's like, or the puzzle is, you figure out the trick.
Yeah. So you went to church twice what's the second time? Obviously the first time is services, right?
In the morning. Well, we had service in the morning and we had service in the evening.
Oh, 2 services. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Not like, I thought it was like religious school. And then, cause like I had religious school on Saturday mornings, but then it would go into like a half hour, like little service, they would just bring out the Torah and.
Oh yeah. No, this is like Dutch Calvinist, Protestant. And then I also went to our church. I grew up in the sort of Dutch immigrant community and everybody sort of went to the same churches, but then the churches also had schools. And so I went to the Dutch Calvinist schools as well, all through college, so there was a lot of Bible.
I mean, sorry, I'm stuttering because I'm like, are you a person of faith?
It's a complicated question, but I'm not in the straightforward way that I used to be. I was into my 20s and I've kind of, it's more complicated now. I haven't gone to church, in many, many years. But so, I think I still have spiritual practices. I still have religious practices. They're just not Christian Protestant ones like they used to be. If anything, I'm kind of just like a hobbyist Buddhist at this point, It's kind of like a hobby.
Yeah. I mean, you were there, like Protestantism, especially like Calvinism, like that is American, like that, like the things that you learned or that were part of your life for your first couple decades was the way that the stuff that formed America the way it is now. And I'm wondering if you find any like, or how that if you've thought about that, if you thought about how that formed you personally.
Well, I think what I notice now is I I kind of feel like I can see both sides. I like what I can see is like sometimes I see in Christian, like evangelical Christians, like I came from, I can understand the siege mentality that they feel sometimes. And then so it's sometimes it's like I can still speak the language, you know what I mean? Like I could still hear the subtleties and the like dialect and the like, I don't know, like I can hear what they're hearing when you know, but like when they say the media, like they mean like one thing, but like when people who aren't in the church say the media, they might mean a different thing, stuff like that. If that, I'm not explaining it that well, I don't feel like, but you still can sort of hear, like sometimes I'll hear someone use the word culture. They'll say something that's, they'll talk about relativism or cultural relativism. And that when I hear that, I always think like, oh, that person I think is coming from a church background, or they themselves are a Christian still, because there's like little words like that like sort of get used within the community, but then it's like outside like mainstream American language, you don't really use certain words in the same way. So yeah.
Did you find it personally meaningful when you were younger, or was it just like, well, I have to do this because my parents want me to?
No, you know, I felt I took it pretty seriously. I was pretty sincere, and I was into it.
Like, how did it manifest in your daily life?
Well, you know, the community I grew up in was pretty it was pretty homogenous. Like, you know, a lot of people I knew were similar to me. Like everybody went to church, you know, like it was I grew up in South Holland, Illinois, and most of the people I knew all went to the same churches and went to the same schools. And so it, from the outside, we kind of looked like mainstream suburbanite Midwesterners. But then, you know, there were the thing, you know, everybody prayed before meals, and you would read, you know, they'd read devotionals before meals, and go to church and all this kind of stuff. But I don't know. It's hard to look from the outside in and see what all the weird differences are, you know. You kind of have to go to some other culture to see your own culture, because you're like, oh, they do this and we do this, you know?
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to get a picture of like how much of your early life was about religion.
I don't know how to answer the question. I mean, probably not that much. From the outside, just looking at me, I was just kind of like a normal suburban kid, and we went to a Christian school, went to a Christian church, but it wasn't like, you know, it wasn't like
Amish. I don't,
yeah,
and I didn't think
yeah.
it was, but I'm just saying like it wasn't like all encompassing.
No, and you know, the Dutch Calvinist tradition I came from was, you know, in the spectrum of Protestant Christians is more on the world, you know, the worldly side, as they, you know, would say. Like even the college I went to, which was called Calvin College, now it's called Calvin University. You know, among the Christian colleges, that was considered kind of a loose, liberal, you know, worldly college. But then anyone coming from, you know, a secular Ivy League college would be like, wow, this is you know, people are going to chapel, and, you know, every class, everybody is talking about the Bible and stuff, you know.
Yeah. Is Calvinism the one like there's lay ministers? There's no like hierarchy.
No, there's definitely ministers. They're not like priests like in the Catholic Church. You know, they're definitely
Right.
lay preachers, but they tend to go to seminary, you know, and they get like a special education, but it's not like they have special powers or anything like within the hierarchy or anything. They're just,
Sure.
you know, And, going back to what we were talking about, I think when I was young, I would go, a lot of my friends were preachers' kids, and I would go to their house, and their dad would have, their dads would be preachers in churches, and their dads would have like a room in the house that was like their study, and they would have like a desk in there, and they would have like the walls would be lined with books. And as a kid, I was like, that's what I want. Like I want, and so, because even as a young age, I loved books and I loved reading books. And then I think if you love books and you come up in a community like I came up in, people, the adults all kind of push you toward the ministry because they're like, oh, book people who are Christians should go to seminary and be ministers because, those are the people who read and learn Hebrew and learn Latin and decipher the difficult stuff, the difficult parts of the Bible or whatever.
Did you feel pressure to go in that direction?
Oh, that was my plan. I went to college planning to go to seminary. But then once I was at college, I kind of was like, no, I don't think this is for me.
Like what, I mean, did you actually, when you were younger before that, did you actually feel a calling, or did you just think this is what I should be doing?
Well, feeling a calling is kind of, it's like special language, right? It's like you feel a calling, and I think a lot of ministers or a lot of people who go into the religious orders and so on and so forth, they say they feel a calling, and it's what that actually means is probably varies a lot from person to person. I don't feel like I had a voice come to me out of the void, and tell me what to do. I felt like I'm saying, I felt like, oh, I love books and I love thinking about things and I love big ideas. And if you're a sincere Christian in my community, that's what you do. You drift toward that, you go to seminary and you read all the books that you're supposed to read, etc. And, but yeah, I didn't get a telegram out of nowhere, or a voice didn't come out.
Yeah. No owl showed up with a
yeah. And so I guess, it wasn't a calling,
Well, no, because I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like, you use the word drifting, and it might have just been like a word choice, but like, yeah. I was trying to figure out like how much of it. Sorry,
I'm sort of like, I'm in the language now, like we're talking about it. So I'm like, that's like religious language. You drift away from the church, like that kind of thing. That's why I said that. Yeah.
Cause there is some stuff where you're just like, definitely there have been times in my life where I didn't make conscious decisions about stuff, and I kind of just was buffeted along by other forces that were pushing on me, and just like moved in those directions, as opposed to like consciously saying like, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. It was kind of just like I'm floating in a certain direction.
Yeah. I mean, like I have a sense of myself and a sense of irony and about myself enough to realize that I actually did do it. Like I do have a room in my life now. I have a bunch of books on the wall, and I have a desk that I sit at. And, in the way that in the past, I think I was attracted to the being a preacher, because what I was really attracted to was the idea that they got to study all week, and then they had to like present a sermon on Sunday. So it felt like this cool, like weekly creative outlet where you could, and another thing that I haven't talked about this very much, but growing up, I had a minister at the church that we went to who would cry. He would cry a lot. Like while he was preaching, he would like get so worked up that he sometimes would be beside himself and he would weep. And I think that made a big impression on me, that like, here was this man, and he was like really like feeling it, And so I was attracted to that as well, I think. And I have a sense of myself enough to know that like, I just moved it into comics. Like I want to do a weekly comic. I want to do a weekly comic strip. And so like I work all week and I try to get a page done every week, and it's the same thing. It's just, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still trying to decipher the word, the word of God, quote unquote, that's like comes down to me through whatever, so
Yeah.
it hasn't changed. It's not really, I haven't drifted that far away.
Yeah. Now the stereotype of Protestantism in America is it's at least
Careful
waspy.
now. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I'm going to say
Yeah.
wasp. Like there's a kind of like emotional, maybe not alienation, but maybe repression. Because I think
Sure.
it's interesting, like that there's a minister who like becomes so like worked up into it that he is like weeping, right? And
Yeah.
I was curious if you were in a household where emotions were okay to talk about, or it was okay to express them and feel them, and maybe not okay, but just like you were encouraged.
I don't know how to speak to it, because I feel like there's stereotypes within stereotypes within stereotypes, right? Like there's also the stereotype of like what it means to express your emotions. I think, to answer the question sort of from a side angle, like it wasn't an artistic family. It wasn't like a family of writers and creative people. It was kind of like, and so when I started being a little bit weird, where I would like write poems and I would like draw comics, et cetera, I think there was a little discomfort with that. And there was a little pressure to like, this is nice, but when are you going to figure out what you're really going to do, which kind of pushed me then to kind of react by saying like, no, this is what I'm going to do, that kind of thing. And so I did sort of grow up in a environment where there wasn't a lot of role models of creativity other than what I'm saying is like the preacher who like writes a sermon every week or something like that. And so as I got older in high school, et cetera, I started looking around for other models of ways that I could, be creative. I don't like the word creative that much. Be playful, just like play around, screw around, and like make things and role play or like play make believe, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if that kind of answers the question from a different angle.
I mean, what were those outlets for you then when you got into high school?
Well, it's really, so I always point to a couple things. One is my friend got a desktop computer. His dad got a desktop computer, and the desktop computer had the program Microsoft Publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And I was already into comic books at that point, but Microsoft Publisher, you could like put images and text on a page and like make a multi-page document. And my mind was blown. I was like, we could make our own magazine. And I don't know there's something about that was so exciting to me so me and my friends started making our own comics and zines, basically. And then we kind of started doing it before we even realized that other people were making zines, and like zines were like a thing. This is like in the early 90s. We were just like dumb kids who kind of put two and two together. And so we started making comics and zines. But then once we started like going to record stores, going to comic book stores, we started realizing that all these other people were doing the same thing. Xerox technology was available and ubiquitous, and a lot of people were doing the same thing. And so I really got stuck on that, like the way that when you're 14 or something, you get stuck on the thing that like blows your mind. Like I really got stuck on the fact that like I could make a little booklet myself and print it myself. And that kind of like organized the rest of my life. That's what I wanted to do all the time. So
was that now you said that's how you wanted to organize your life. Like it was like an obsession, right? And I'm curious about like, as you go to college and you start to realize that like, you don't want to be a minister.
Uh-huh.
Is it that I'm trying to figure out the dynamic. Is it that the obsession kind of starts to take over for that and replaces it, and you start to like just not go to church anymore, or like what's actually happening in your life as you're like figuring out like, oh, this isn't actually what I want?
Well, what's actually happened. So the other thing that I'll get to that, but the other thing that happened in high school that was weird was that a bunch of other people in high school made underground newspapers. And this was this weird thing that happened in my high school where, like, because we could just print and Xerox things, a bunch of groups of people in the high school sort of like separately came up with this idea to do underground newspapers. So at one time there was almost like 4 or 5 underground newspapers going on at the same time. It was like so fun and so interesting to me. And then I ended up becoming like, I was like, I want to be friends with all these people. So like we all kind of like found each other and became friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we transitioned into college. It's like I was still just making the comics and zines and quote unquote underground newspapers that we were doing in high school. And because so many of my high school friends also came with to college, I kind of spent a lot of my college years just focused on making my comics and making and printing things. I didn't like join clubs or make new friends or like, I just was like, this is what I'm going to do. And so I just like did that all the time, and sometimes when I look back on that, and at the same time I was like, reading all the books, and I was a pretty like earnest, sincere student. And so I was trying to get good grades. And I was trying to write like papers that were like, smart and stuff. Looking back on it now, of course, it's like, oh, brother, but I was really, staying up late and trying to read all the books and everything. So that's kind of what happened in college, is like doubling down on making comics all the time while also like trying to read all the books that I, get all the good grades.
I mean, when does the obsession become something you're like, well, I'm going to start, I want to like produce comics, and I want people to, outside of this small circle to buy them and read them?
Well, I don't know. It never really, it's not like there was, let me think of how this goes. Like when I was in high school, like I was saying, there were these underground newspapers. And so it was kind of expected that you would just make something and then give it away, or like get it in front of as many people as possible. So there wasn't like a fear that like I was just doing it for myself. But then there, also like I was in this sort of little bubble, but like punk or zine DIY culture kind of like penetrated far enough that like I understood that there was this thing called punk rock, and there was this like, I wasn't even interested in punk rock that much. I was interested in DIY culture, and I was kind of interested in the idea of like DIY networks and like people doing their own thing, and everybody was just writing letters to each other and sending zines to each other in the mail. And in college, I just started doing that. I started sending my zines to people. I had a sense that I wasn't ready to really push my zine on everybody. So like I would send my zine to certain people who I thought might like it, but it's not like I ever sent my zines to like publishers thinking that like, oh, I'm going to like make a career out of this. I always thought it was going to be my side thing while I had some kind of day job.
Mm-hmm.
And I never really was interested in like, oh, I want to become, famous and have a beloved cartoon character that America, loves and is on t-shirts, etc. That wasn't that interesting to me. It was always interesting to me just to be like known within this kind of like small network of people who made the kind of stuff that I liked.
I guess the thing I'm trying to figure out, and I'll just blatantly say it, is that, you said you came from this kind of homogenous town, you grew up very religious, right? How do you gain the self-awareness to push against that? Or like, I think of a lot on this show that like to do creative work or to be playful, as you said, right, requires some kind of like to be othered in some way, right? To push back against the culture that's handed to you instead of just going along with it and being like, whatever, I keep calling it like beer commercial ideology, right? That's what I call like mass culture. Like you're told that you want to play beach volleyball with girls in bikinis. Like that's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to like
really
draw mini. Yeah, that's and I think you're just like slightly older than me, but like I remember growing up in the 80s, like like Coors Light or whatever, like those commercials.
Yeah, like a beer commercial sort of.
Yeah, that tells you
ideology.
what yeah, you should like football, you should like all this other kind of stuff. And if you don't, like I was a kid who liked Weird Al and the Monkees, and who else? Like not a lot of other people in my circles liked those things, or liked whatever other weird stuff I got into eventually, Adult Swim and that kind of stuff.
The really weird stuff.
Yeah. Or like, again, like alternative comics and like all this other kind of stuff that I eventually got into. Free jazz, name your thing. And I'm wondering for you, what's the wedge that got in there that like started to push you apart from this homogenous culture?
I mean, to be honest, I feel like the answer is not that interesting. I feel like the answer is actually just some like arbitrary mix of like personality elements, the way that you're treated by either your parents or your peers. There might even be just some weird moment where you feel like an outsider, and the seed starts to grow in you where you're like, I'm not, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing either. Like you could become, that seed could grow in you and you could become some kind of like ridiculous, egomaniac where you're like, I'm this, I'm the most special weirdo on, whatever. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I think it's just one of those things, it's like, if there's just the right moment where the right hangout with like I guess the other thing I haven't really talked about is that I was a jock. Like I was a jock growing up, and my family were all into athletics. And I was good. I was like coordinated and good at sports. And so I played tons of baseball. I played tons of basketball. Like but there was like a moment, and I played baseball for years and years and years, but slowly growing in me was this sense that like, I'm not like these baseball guys, not necessarily even like I'm better than them. It's just that I'm not interested in the same things. Like they talk about something and I think, why are we talking about that? Or they'll be like, you'll go to a baseball camp and they'll be like, we're going to eat baseball, sleep baseball, dream base, and they're just like, yeah. And there'd be a moment where I'd be like, I don't like baseball that much, like baseball's fine. But things like that would happen and then as I kind of grew into self-awareness over my teens, I was like, actually, maybe I don't have to play sports, And so it's like something like that. I think there's just the seeds can be planted at some point where you're like you might have a friend say, and you're like, I watched this really cool show on TV. And then they're like, oh, you liked that show? I didn't really like that show. And then just that at that moment, there might be this like little seed planted in your consciousness that I'm not the same as this, my friend, and I may be different, and I think those seeds just grow. And over time, you either like become a real, like, I don't feel like I have a personality where I get in Buddhism, they would call it aversive. Like I don't have an aversive personality where like I want to fight everybody, or like when someone's different than me, I want to like fight them, or I want to assert like you're wrong and I'm right, or something like that. And so I kind of like became my own person, but I also didn't like react really strongly. Like I never really felt comfortable with the whole punk thing in terms of how angry it would get. Like I think about this a lot. A lot of the guys who are a little bit older than me, who I kind of looked up to when I was coming up as an artist, were punk rock Gen X guys. And sometimes it's like they get very angry about certain things. And I always think like, I don't have that in me. Like, I don't have that anger that like manifests as like, smash the bullshit, smash this, fuck this. I don't really have that the same, but I definitely have a sense of like, oh, I'm different than the usual milieu that I grew up in. But, I don't feel like it's that dramatic either.
I mean, what specifically then, if you can remember, were those seeds, or was the seed? Like, was it a friend? Like, you liked, I don't know, what year is this? You like A Different World, and they're like, what? No, I don't like A Different World.
There's all these weird things that I could trace it back, and I don't know if it's interesting or if it's boring, because it might be boring because it's so particular to me, but maybe it's interesting because it's so particular. But, like what would it be? Like, I remember liking to read books. My mom liked to read books. So I would go to the library with her and I would get books. And then I started reading science fiction books, and science fiction books, of course, are interesting to like a brainy, nerdy kid. And science fiction eventually led me to read Neuromancer, the William Gibson book, which of course, and we also had like an early desktop computer, which blew my mind. So I was like, oh, this, this pattern recognition, like brain that I had was like, oh, really interested in this computer, and then interested in science fiction. And then I remember what happened was I got interested in cyberpunk, right? William Gibson, cyberpunk. And I sort of had this thing where I would just order books that I was interested in. And somehow I saw this book called Storming the Reality Studio, a case book of cyberpunk fiction. And just like, I don't even know how old I was, but I ordered this book, and I was like, oh, I'll read this book that's all about cyberpunk stuff, because I like cyberpunk stuff. And in the back of that book, there was this thing where this writer was like, here's all the lineage of the cyberpunk aesthetic. And he listed like movies, and he listed many like bands, like, everything from Velvet Underground to Talking Heads to Sonic Youth and then like, like Neil Young Trans album, like all these things where like I was just young enough that I was like, I don't know what any of this stuff is. So I would like go to the record store and like go to the V's and look up Velvet Underground and get a tape, and listen to the Velvet Underground. And like, I think that list of things in that cyberpunk book, that was the thing that I like latched onto. That I was just like, I'm going to go look up everything that's on this list. And through that, like a lot of worlds opened up, and that's how it works,
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody, like it's the same old story that like everybody goes through, I think, who knows what it's like now. Now it's like, who knows how it works? It's like people are digging through weird Russian message boards to try to find like, what's the good electronic music that's coming out of Africa that is on this Russian message board. And then that leads you to the, it's like,
but it's still the same. It's still the same basic dialectic or whatever. It's still the same. It has the same shape of pushing you out of the path that you probably would have been on if you hadn't read this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Do you remember what it was specifically about cyberpunk that got you?
No, I don't. I mean, it was just the time, it was like I played a lot of Atari growing up, and I played a lot of Atari. And then I remember the movie Tron. I saw Tron in the theater and it blew my mind, and it's like neon glowing things in the darkness and grids in the darkness, all that kind of thing. It spoke to me,
And so while the other baseball players are talking about RBIs or whatever, like you are thinking about the grid and Tron.
No, it's not quite like that, but no.
I know, I'm just goofing around.
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, so that's the first thing that starts like pushing you apart from this or giving you like, because this is the theory that I have, is that like once you have that kind of like, once you're pushed apart just a little bit, it gives you a bit of self-awareness that you might not have had otherwise, because now you are seeing yourself in opposition to another group.
Sure. Classic dialectic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then that is that little bit of self-awareness, to me, more than the thing that you're reading, the self-awareness is the seed that then you have that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like the same old story too, in the sense that like, I was reading this book a couple months ago that was talking about, I don't even know if it's important what the book's about, but this guy had this idea that like human beings are biologically in the way that like our development from babies to adult humans goes through various stages, and certain biological things happen at certain times, etc. That there's almost like programmed in our biological clock that when you're a certain age, like in your early teens or something, you will just automatically have a moment of like mystical epiphany that sort of like brings together your surroundings, your sense of self, and a sense of like a powerful mysticism that's just programmed in every human being. And like whatever your situation happens to be is going to color what that actually looks like for each individual. But I never heard that, it's the kind of idea too of the vision quest,
Mm-hmm.
in traditional cultures and stuff like that. I never really heard the idea that kind of thing was actually programmed into like brain development or something, but I'd have to look up to see where he's getting that, that idea from. But I think that's definitely something that happens, and you can't necessarily plan when it's going to happen. That suddenly there are these going to be, either one big moment or probably like multiple moments in your teens when you suddenly have this like expanded sense of like, here I am on this planet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and a sense of like, either like I'm embraced by my surroundings and my community, and I'm a part of it, and it's flowing through me, and I'm a culmination of my ancestors, et cetera. Or you have a sense of like, what am I doing? Like, you see yourself and you're like, what am I doing? Like, what is happening? It's like you wake up,
Uh-huh. Yeah. So it was really just this kind of like, as you said before, drifting. Like as you find this stuff, you just kind of like slowly start to like, as if you're on a like ice flow, move away from the land.
Yeah. I mean, I ended up moving away as well. I like physically moved away from where I grew up. And that was a big part of it, a whole new world.
At what point do you realize that this is something that you have professionalized, that this is for real?
I don't know. I think it's a much slower process than talking about it might, talking about it might make it seem like, oh yeah, but I think it was a slow process that happened in multiple stages.
Like, do you mind going through just like, we're right at the end of the show, but like, do you mind just going through like the very early stages of you doing this for real? Of you making comics for real?
Sure. It was like the heavens opened up, it was like, I started reading comics from the local drugstore, and very quickly after reading the first few comic books, I started drawing the characters, and I did not, like I said, I grew up in a family, we didn't draw, we didn't write. Like I hadn't drawn anything in a bazillion years, and suddenly I was drawing these characters. And then I don't know how long after, but I think I sat down at this desk. I remember it vividly. I sat down at the desk in my bedroom had some paper out, and I started drawing a comics page, like panel, and this another panel, and then a word balloon. And it was unspeakably, it was like, it was the best thing. And I was just like, this is it. This is it from now on. I'm so happy sitting down with a piece of paper and trying to like trace out a story on it. I remember it clearly because I even remember getting called up for dinner and going upstairs and sitting at the table. Like that's how, I don't have a lot of memories in my mind where like I actually have a lot of space around the memory where it's like, this was an event and I remember a lot around it. But drawing the first comics was like that, where I was like, oh, this is a new thing in my life that will now probably, it's here to stay. And then after that, I just kept doing it,
Mm-hmm. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was fun. It went by fast.
How do you feel? Good? Bad?
Oh, I feel fine. How do you feel?
Good. I couldn't tell whether you were, you're a contemplative person, but I couldn't tell whether you're like, I don't like talking about this kind of stuff. Because you said early on,
I kind of don't, to be honest.
not wanting to do autobiographical comics. You're like, well, I don't want to I just don't want to talk about some of this stuff.
Well, it's funny because I was talking to my partner before this, and she's like, you're a very private person, and I don't necessarily like to, but at the same time, like once you get me going, like I'll talk about it, but it's not like I would seek it out. It's like, it's not like this burning thing where I have to unburden myself. If anything, it's like, when I talk about stuff like this, I think like, this is going to upset, this relative, or this is going to upset this friend or something, it's like, I kind of want to just keep it all like,
No, I get, there's like a line in the sand that my wife and I have drawn, both with talking about our families and with talking about like our relationship, where we're just like, let's keep some stuff for ourselves.
Well, I'm interested to hear about that, because it sounds like a good idea to have a line in the sand, but I don't have a sense that I have a line in the sand. How do you draw that line?
Well, there's just, I could say this because my wife's talked about it, but like, her father, she's estranged from her father. Right. So, but she doesn't really but she like kind of is in touch with him every once in a while, but she just doesn't talk about him on stage really. It might change in the future, but we don't really talk about like we have a podcast together. We don't talk about our sex lives because we're like, that's for us. We don't want to talk about this we don't want to commodify this stuff. So we're just not going to talk about it in public.
Yeah. Cause then it creeps into the actual bedroom.
Well, I don't know, but that's we just let's not even find out. Let's just this is,
no, it's good.
Here's the line in the sand. We're not talking about this stuff.
But don't you have a perverse, the problem is, right, that you draw these lines, and then because we're creative people and we're we're kind of I have the problem sometimes where it's I'll draw a line, and then it's now that I've drawn that line, the perverse part of me really wants to push that line, or because I've drawn that line, I have to go over that line because that's the way forward. So.
This is the thing. This is I think this is maybe the big difference between us is that if it's a self-imposed line, I find that, or if someone uses their authority to tell me to do something, but I deem that authority to be rational and have thought through certain things, then I follow that. Then it's not a big deal. I don't push against that stuff. But if someone is arbitrarily telling me to do something, that's when I do push against that stuff. And then I go way across the line, probably in a bad way.
Right. Yeah, I can see what you're saying. It's when you make the line, if you say to yourself, this is coming from the deepest part of me, and I really sincerely feel this. This isn't just me, whatever.
Yeah. But thanks, Kevin. This is I've been reading your comics for like decades now. I mean, since I lived in Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, yeah.
Yeah. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye, bye, begin.